And welcome back. I hope you are all having a phenomenal week. I'm excited to be continuing our conversation today with Julie Walsh. It was such a lovely conversation last time. I'm so glad we were able to find some more time to talk this week itself. For a quick reminder, she is the Whitehead Associate Professor of Critical Thought and the Associate Professor of Philosophy and the Director of the Suzy Newhouse Center for the Humanities at Wellesley College. Her work spans early modern philosophy, feminist thought, and the ethics of digital technology. Last conversation, we spoke a lot about ethics, and today we're going to get into the depths of freedom, which I'm really excited for. But we were just talking about dogs and the privilege of just being able to sometimes be around other species to get this kind of perspective where it's not so human centric all the time, which I feel like every time I step into New York, I forget that any other animal exists. And I'm like, it is only humans and it is all about humans. And then you like leave and then you're like, no, there's dogs and cats and squirrels. And I've never spent a lot of time with hippos and lions, but I would like my consciousness to eventually expand to be able to like include them when I think about things and life in general. I mean, do you have like in your experience, have you spent more time with dogs or cats?
I am 100% a dog person. Cats, I always feel like cats are sort of planning something. And I don't know, it doesn't seem like it's a good thing that they're planning. So I also have allergies to cats. So I think I never was able to give them really a fair hearing. But
Mm.
it's interesting, I think about a 7-minute drive from my campus, there is a sanctuary. And I went there last fall with one of my classes. And just speaking to your point, kind of seeing, and all of these animals have either, they have incredible stories. Some of them literally ran away from slaughterhouses. Some of them were being shown at petting zoos and then discarded when they got too big. So they all have this kind of tragic backstory. But and the sanctuary has created an environment where, as close as possible, animals can live out their natural drives and their natural instincts. But seeing the way that they behave was it was destabilizing, I think, to a lot of us, because especially for those of us who have spent time with domesticated animals, like especially dogs and cats, watching the way that the Highland cows act, they act a lot like dogs. The way that they play, and these animals are enormous, and one of them kind of adopted something like a downward dog posture with one of the humans he trusted because he wanted to play with her. And then my students were like, oh my gosh, he's acting like a dog. And it was this kind of rupture moment of the way that we're socialized to think of some animals as food and some animals as companions. And
Mm.
a little later in our journey, they had several pigs, and one of the pigs actually they rescued from a dorm room at Boston University, where some student thought it was a good idea to get a pig and try to keep the pig in his dorm room. And that didn't work out well. So they have a couple of pigs, and pigs are very social creatures, but when they are raised alone, in adolescence or adulthood, they can't live with other pigs because they don't have the sort of memory, I guess, of being young with pigs. So they get aggressive when they're together, but they are lonely. And like, it was so moving to see the chickens on the farm adopt the pigs.
No way.
So when we were walking around, you could see the pigs all in their little sunspots snoozing, and each pig had a hen snuggled up against it. And when we asked the people working there about it, they were like, well, these are all the pigs' emotional support chickens, that they aren't aggressive with the chickens, and the chickens have some kind of sense that the pigs need them. So it was just, kind of, again, speaking to your point, being confronted with the fact that these other species need the same kind of comforts that we need, and they suffer just as we suffer when they don't have it. And
Mm.
it was, it was a really incredible experience to be able to observe. And like they were all amazing parts, but one of my favorite parts is that there was an alpaca who was the mayor. So she was just in the middle of the sanctuary, and you kind of had to appease her in order to get by. So she's just kind of sitting there looking at everybody, and you had to go feed her romaine in order to get passage to walk into the other parts of the space. So they also had this very intense protector at the outset of the space looking out for them. So so I think as much as, I'm a dog person, I love dogs. I have a healthy respect for bigger animals where I will admire them from afar, but I don't really want to get too close. But I also think that I feel like I have grown, certainly as a person and as a human, in recognizing that animals in this country that are farmed for food, they have desires and loves and fears in the same way I do. And I think that has been an incredibly hard thing to confront. But, I have a cousin who told me recently, when he was talking to me about his vegan journey, he said when he became vegan, it felt like there was a hole in his heart he didn't know was there, closed. And I thought that was that was kind of a poetic way of putting it. And I think, kind of connecting these dots, I feel like what he described felt very much like what I experienced watching these cows and pigs and chickens sort of just live peacefully. Yeah.
This is something that I have a little bit of a monologue in response because I have, there's this thing that I've just been sitting on and trying to work through that I think has deep implications in education, but just this kind of, I think we've segmented our society into so many different niche kind of things where, like, for example, I have never seen the actual process of any of the meat that I've ever eaten be killed. So, for example, when I was recently in Peru, I was walking through these markets and we were, cooking a lot. And it was the first time I like saw cow heads and I saw an entire, all these guinea pigs because they eat a lot of guinea pigs, like all of them just kind of lined out rather than just seeing a packaged with the meat where it's like, it might as well be vegetables that I'm buying, for all that I know, they both are created in the same way. I have no idea what's happening on the backside. And like, with farms, at least you sometimes get to drive through them. You're at least you have some conception. I've driven through a lot of farms. So I have some conception of what a farm looks like, though I haven't spent too much time living on one. But with these like slaughterhouses and things, I've never even really seen them or been part of them. So I just have to deal with the kind of final product of whatever comes out, and everything else is just shielded from me. But I think societally, we do that with death, we do that with sickness, we do that with children. I've never seen a child be born. I've never even seen a child in the first couple hours, like maybe, here and there, but you don't ever get to see these aspects of life until it happens to you.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden, now you're exposed to this whole new world. I mean, I think we do that with the healthcare system, with going to jail. You don't really know, too much about the system until all of a sudden, boom, you're here, and you're like, okay, now I'm in front of a jury. I have no idea what's going on. But we've done that to such an extent, it's insane. And I think we do that in school where if you study engineering, you don't know anything about what's going on in maybe art history. If you're studying art history, you don't know anything what's really going on. And it's, I think we have segmented so much to where I think there is no, I think about, sorry, I think about this all the time, which is like, I don't really know how my sewer system works. I flush and then my sewage system, it just works and then it's gone. And then I get all this water. I'm like, where's all this water coming from? I mean, and I think a big piece of maybe feeling more connected with so much of life, of these things, is actually integrating the narratives to actually just increase a certain level of awareness of how all of these things are connected. How do I get my water? How do I get my food? But there seems to be very little, I feel like, attention placed on that. You have any hypotheses why?
Well, yeah. I mean, I think there, humankind has a long history of outsourcing the, for lack of a better word, like the guts of the human experience to the less privileged. And, there are people who work in the slaughterhouse every day, who are maintaining the sewers, who like think about, the healthcare workers who are in the ER mopping up viscera all the time and seeing people at their most vulnerable. So I think there is, I mean, it's too reductive to say that this all kind of reduces to class, but I think that there are Yeah. I mean, there are strata, social strata that sort of determine who has the privilege of being shielded from things. And I
Yeah.
think, just taking the slaughterhouse example, they're in New England, this was about a year ago, there was an expose that one of the local NPR stations did about undocumented kids, literal children working in very dangerous slaughterhouses. And one of the sort of from what I could tell, that one of the stories about it was that these were children who were sent from their home countries in Latin America to live with relatives or family friends in New England. And they would go to school all day and then work night shift in meat processing plants, because that was an industry that wasn't too careful about documentation and age. And the reason why it became known is because a child died and several others were very severely injured by the machinery that was involved. And in hearing the story, I mean, obviously, there's a whole kind of segment of that story about immigration and child labor, but the grotesqueness of processing a dead animal for food was sort of at the forefront of this story. And even though I am aware of what happens in slaughterhouses and processing facilities, it is incredibly hard to listen to because it's disgusting. And I mean that not in a colloquial sense. I mean that in the kind of philosophical sense of the affective response of disgust. And we tend to try to avoid things that disgust us. And I think, if you look at children's books are such a great access point into thinking about how we separate our psychologies on certain issues. So children's books have tons of animals in them, but already we see the difference between poultry, which is food, and chickens, which are animals, or beef, which is food, and cows, which are animals. Pork is food, but pigs are animals. So even when we think about how we teach children
That's interesting.
vocabulary, we're already separating it. And similarly with kind of thinking about incarceration and thinking about healthcare, there are many, I mean, we have millions upon millions of neighbors who could tell us very easily about those experiences. But one of the things that comes with economic privilege is not having to think about it. Like until you're forced to confront it. And I think with respect to systems like the carceral system, the healthcare system, especially in the US, and the food system, the people in power have a lot of interest in making sure that we don't know about it. And we talked about this a little bit last time with respect to scientific research on animals. There's a good reason why it's not part of sort of kind of cocktail party conversation that people doing basic science and biological experimentation on mammals aren't going to share that in non-scientific company, because they, for very good reason, they know that it's horrific to hear about.
I think even in hearing what you said, I was having a tough day yesterday, so I just let myself lay on the couch and watch movies. So that was really nice. I watched two movies. I watched Sinners and I watched Dead Poet Society, which I wanted to get back to
Whoa,
after a while.
what a combo. Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
But even in thinking about Dead Poet Society, I always really, my favorite movies, if I'm ever feeling like a lack of, if I lose my sauce for why I teach, why I love education, I feel like Dead Poet Society and there's this other movie called The Whale, which are both, I think, have you seen The Whale?
No.
Phenomenal piece about English as well, just writing and the power of writing something real. But I, watching Dead Poet Society, I don't know, I felt this deep sense of, I think it is only through art and creativity that these like really sad parts of humanity can actually be channeled into something very, I don't know, you can feel it, it's, I don't think you can necessarily do the same thing with just like habits and routines and all the
No.
other ways that people fill up their life. But I think there is something through poetry and these type of things
Yeah.
where a negative experience doesn't necessarily have to end there. You can actually channel it into something that is so beautiful and profound. And I I just wish, because I mean I see this with so many of the students I teach, like how much their parents yearn to kind of protect them from the world, like protect them from the world. Like I don't want you to see what it really is. But I wonder what the causes and harms of that ends up being,
Mhm.
where it's like, like the world is what the world is, but at the same time, I myself haven't seen the depravities that exist out there to the extent that it does, and so the real question I think is how much as a human do you have the capacity to hold space for the worst out there without becoming a
Yeah.
nihilist yourself, without becoming deeply cynical, to still hold hope for humanity. That I think is the really tough balance. Where if
Yeah.
you don't develop that resilience, the second you realize some of the terrible thing humanities have done and continue to do, you immediately are just like, we're screwed, people suck, it's done,
Yeah.
but to balance that space of like people are capable of this, but still there is hope, I think is the challenge.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm now gonna try very hard to do a little segue to talking about freedom because I think it's related. So bear with me. So I think one one thing I was thinking about with respect to like what does it mean to kind of confront these, the dark underbelly of humanity. And while you were talking, I was thinking about, believe it or not, I was thinking about Rene Descartes. And in his correspondence with Princess Elizabeth, she takes him to task on a lot of different elements of his system. And I think he does a real poor job of defending himself. But one of the things that she's writing to him about is that she has a lot of health problems. So maybe today we might call it migraine, but she has something going on with her health that makes it hard for her to focus and concentrate. And she also has all of these family problems. So her family's been exiled. She has like a delinquent brother. There's like lots of pressures on her. And she's like, how can I believe everything you say in the meditations, but like, I want to be free. I want to be free to like reason and think about the Pythagorean theorem and but like my body is making it hard for me to do so. My family situation, she's like, help me out. Like how can I make this work? And among other things, Descartes seems to suggest that in order to be truly happy, and to the extent that like using your freedom with the utmost reason is kind of consistent with being happy, we need to gather information in such a way that we approach the infinite science. So God has the infinite science in God's mind and is able to act with this radical freedom. And it seems as though Descartes' suggestion is the same. And he's not the only early modernist who's going to say that the more you know, the more free you are. But Elizabeth, I think, very astutely points out that the solution to happiness and freedom being essentially having God level knowledge is not very practical for most humans. But to connect this with what you were just saying, there is something interesting in thinking about, because I think when we think about augmenting and increasing our knowledge, we typically don't think about knowledge of the bad stuff. So when we talk about this, we're like, oh yeah, like, oh geez, I've never read like, James Joyce. So like, okay, got to read that. And like, oh, I don't understand the stars and the constellations. So I'm going to figure that out in mathematics and physics, Um, but I think it's interesting to imagine like, well, surely part of the knowledge we need to have in order to truly be free is self-knowledge. And how can we truly know ourselves without having a grasp on these systems that support us? So our food systems, our infrastructure systems. So maybe there's an argument here to be made for, aside from the aesthetic beauties of poetry and prose and music and so forth, that may be part of developing asymptotically the infinite, asymptotically approaching the infinite science, maybe part of the knowledge we need is actually to get into the guts. Like, what do these things look like? Who is managing them? How do I feel about them? Right? If there's an incredibly strong emotional and or intellectual response to the way that not only animals suffer in our current food system, but the humans who work to process the food are also suffering. The humans who live, especially near pig farms in the Carolinas, are suffering incredible amounts, environmental damage, psychological damage associated with living near these processing facilities. So if we have strong responses to that, that is augmenting our knowledge, and maybe it's making us act in a way that's more free because we actually better understand these causal relationships in our world.
To see, yeah, I mean, I really like that point that you said of knowledge not always having to be, and even the examples that you gave are often these, and we talked about this last episode, these kind of separated, disjuncted knowledge that can't really penetrate your soul when you learn about the stars. When it can, but more just from a sense of like, wow, that's so beautiful, that's amazing. But then I think when you learn about, poverty, like some of these type of things, I think it's so much closer to the heart that I think you have to in some ways be impacted by
Yeah.
whatever it is you're reading, which I think maybe might be the fear.
Yeah, I think so. It's interesting. I have a student who is writing a thesis on empathy and virtual reality with me this year. And just yesterday, we had a meeting and we were talking about whether, like, what are the conditions required for empathy and can a virtual reality experience meet those conditions? And some of the authors she was engaging with claim that empathy is not a primordial experience because you need the other in order to experience empathy. So you can't empathize on your own. You need somebody else, like another agent, to empathize with. And the idea behind virtual reality is that when you go into the system, you become the other. And so we spent about an hour kind of really getting into like, well, what does that mean? Like, can you go into a virtual reality system and truly forget who you are? I don't think so. Not
Really?
without some kind of like medical intervention or like, I suppose you could take a drug maybe before going in.
Have you played any of these games in virtual reality?
No.
Okay, because honestly,
Well, so maybe one example is that so one of the games that she was telling me about is one where you have the experience of walking out on a ledge. So like the wind.
I've seen that.
Okay, yeah. And apparently it's terrifying. It's very compelling. Yeah. But I was saying to her, like, imagine you have, and she has had that experience. So I said, now imagine you meet somebody who was touring a construction site and they were in an elevator that malfunctioned and they had to walk on a terrifying plank to try to get to safety. And if they recount that story to you and you were like, I know exactly what you mean. I've been there too. That would be absurd to me. To think of like somebody who's recounting this harrowing tale where with one false step, they may have fallen to grave injury. And to think that a person who put on a headset and experienced it in VR, to me, that strikes me as very, I think the person who had the harrowing experience might be irritated by somebody being like, oh yeah, I was in a game where I had that same experience. And so like, we're the same now. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about your experience in these spaces, but I think I feel like this question about VR and empathy is very closely connected with what you've just described, because of course, companies like Meta and Mark Zuckerberg in particular is marketing this tool as an empathy machine. Like you go in the empathy machine and you can become an unhoused person of color and experience that firsthand. And then when you leave the empathy machine, you're going to be a better person. You're going to be more, I don't know what the idea there is, but I think that it confronts several questions related to agency, affect, but also freedom, right? Like, are we gathering information, real information in VR that's going to help us be more reasonable or be more rational? I don't know. So tell me, what experiences
Huh.
have you had?
No, but that is super interesting what you're saying because I think a huge piece of empathy is also simultaneously the recognition that I can never go through what you've been through. And
Mm,
I actually think about this a lot with culture because I have a very curious and sometimes maybe it edges into voyeuristic tendency to just like I love just watching different people, just like how do you navigate the world, this and that. But something that I feel like I've understood is so I grew up in this cult of some sort, and it's a very conservative cult. And it's interesting because I've seen a lot of people, kind of join or come into the group. And it's fascinating because something I've recognized is that unless you experience a part of like truly belonging in the group itself, any experience you have trying to understand it will always be a little separated because you are just the outsider looking in. Because the biggest difference I've noticed for myself is, for example, I'm even with a lot of these interviews and things that I like putting myself in new situations. But if you have the option to leave, or you have the option to quit your experience when you want to quit it, you will
yes,
never have the same experience as someone who doesn't have that.
exactly.
To me, empathy is also a huge recognition of that. It's not just like, oh, we have experienced the same thing and therefore, we I know exactly what it's like. It's also the recognition of, okay, but I had the option to not experience it and I still chose to, while you were forced to in some
Yeah.
ways. Which
Well,
like,
and I experienced it for half an hour.
yeah.
Right. But I
Mm,
think what you say is exactly right. So there's an opting in. But again, I feel like I'm getting to be a broken record here, but the opting in is also a mark of privilege.
hmm.
And
Yeah.
kind of thinking a little bit about, you know, yeah, I think there's something so interesting here, like kind of thinking about what we were talking about a moment ago. Like if you could put on a VR headset and go to what they call the killing floor in a slaughterhouse. I'm just trying to imagine what the people who work in that environment would say if they
Mm,
heard, like, if I found somebody and told them, like, oh yeah, like there's a virtual reality experience where I can like experience your job. What would their reaction be to that? Would it be
mm,
like incredulity? Would they laugh at it? Like, because there's nobody who has that job who thinks it's a good job. It
mm,
in the broadest possible, like the people who work there are not delighted to go to work every day. So it's interesting to think of the kinds of experiences and the kinds of people who are having those experiences that make for good content for VR.
mm,
If we're thinking about
mm,
the kind of VR that is intended to give humans a window into a different kind of humans experience. So
mm.
I'm just thinking, like, would there be an audience for VR where, like, spend an hour in the life of Kim Kardashian? I mean, I have no interest in that, but like I can imagine that might be interesting. And would she be upset if that existed? No, she'd be like, yeah, my life's awesome. Why wouldn't you want to spend an hour in my life? Right. Um, but I think when it comes to the connection between empathy and VR, the idea is to give people experiences that are class speaking below them, right? Like, okay,
Mm,
now you can actually you'll give to charity and you'll be a better person. You'll be more cognizant of other people if you only experience how the other side is living. And there's something
mm,
so, I mean, to borrow your word, there's something so voyeuristic about that. And I think my student is working with, I think it's Bell Hooks, who has an essay about the spectacle of suffering. So this kind of
mm,
commodification of suffering as like a spectacle to be
mm,
observed. And I think there's
mm,
interesting, I think there's the kind of psychological or even metaphysical question about whether virtual reality can elicit empathy. But then there's the further ethical question of, even if it could, should it? Is that something that is
mm,
morally okay or even desirable? I don't
mm.
know. I'm going to wait till my student writes her thesis and
Yeah.
I'll find what the answer is.
I'm curious. Yeah, I mean, I feel like even yeah, I mean I want I have so much to say on this. I feel like I'm curious. I want to move into yeah, as you said earlier, talking about freedom because I feel like the freedom is something that I find to be so fascinating. I mean, the idea of freedom. I have always been somebody who's valued in my own conception of freedom a lot. I was actually just telling a friend a couple days ago, like I think the reason schooling was so difficult for me from a very young age is I just have always hated listening. If anyone tells me a direction, even if I was going to do it, I no longer want to do it anymore. It's like the second someone tells me to do something, I'm like, no. And it's fascinating because I've had that since I was 5, 6. I mean, it's just always, it's not something I developed. It's just something that was just in my brain. And I don't know what that is. You know, what is that some people are like, no, I actually get really happy when I listen to the teacher perfectly and they tell me I did a good job.
It's
And
me.
yeah,
That was me.
there's so many people who just don't want to do that, you know, and I find that to be a huge indication of also who does well in school and who doesn't, which I think oftentimes has no correlation with
No.
intelligence or anything else. It has
Oh, no
something to
question.
do with obedience or you know something
Yes.
else, which is also a very admirable trait in a lot of ways. But I think having a schooling system that prioritizes obedience to the level it does really makes people who are far more competent than they think they are feel like they're just not capable
Yeah.
at all.
Well,
I mean,
and the other face of that coin, there are people who are great rule followers who might take themselves to be smarter than they are because they're getting the positive reinforcement. Um,
yeah.
yeah, so I think with respect to education, I think the big problem that you're surfacing is not, I don't think, not necessarily that um, there's a problem with having rules and prioritizing obedience. I think the problem is that not all minds learn in the same way. And some minds, like mine, thrive on structure. So I like knowing what's coming. Like I didn't create this, but I've definitely adopted the motto no agenda, no attenda. I will not go to a meeting that does not have an agenda circulated in advance. Like I like knowing what's coming and I like being able to follow that. Um, and there are other minds that thrive on the spontaneity of learning, playing, following their creativity where it goes. And I think both the rigid learner and the more spontaneous learner can easily end up in the same place, but they can't in the same classroom because
Mm,
it just so and I know I have some loved ones and friends who went through the Montessori system who loved it. But I think about myself as a young person. I don't think it would have been good for me because I needed more structure. So I think one of the challenges that we have in our education system is that more tailored education is very expensive, so very inaccessible to most people. And then the way that public schools are structured works really well for some subset of students and is disastrous. It's not just that it's neutral for the other students, it's disastrous for them if they have trouble sitting still. And I think I was just telling my students yesterday that like when I don't want to speak for you, but I assume it was similar for you. Like I was like, when I was in middle school, ADHD didn't exist. Did kids have it? Of course. But there was really no medical or social support for kids with ADHD. So I said, like, when I was a kid, they were just bad kids who couldn't follow instructions.
mm,
And of course, students today are like horrified by this because so many of them have been incredibly helped by, like talk therapy, maybe medication, to try to figure out how to navigate their world in a more kind of linear way. So I think we have a huge problem with, schools are underfunded, teachers are overworked. They can't tailor a lesson experience, like a scholastic experience for every kind of learner. So they do the thing that works kind of okay for the biggest number, and it just means everybody else is left at sea. And then, as you rightly point out, what you end up with is a subset of kids who feel smart and competent and that they understand how to do school, and another set of kids who have been labeled bad kids, who have been labeled lazy, who have been told they don't pay attention, who are late turning stuff in, who are late getting to, right? Like all of these negative characteristics start to become part of their personal identity. And then it's very hard to think of themselves as scholars, as knowers, as having something to contribute.
I mean, it's funny because I feel like I work best with all the students who've come into my work who kind of are very much like I need a structure. I need one. I honestly actually do I don't think they really enjoy working with me, but it's like all the students I work with who are like, hey, what are we doing today? Like kind of just like it's so much more of an open dynamic.
Yeah.
It works so well. And I find that to even be fascinating. Connecting that to freedom, I'm curious I want to first define that word is so ubiquitous and just kind of a hard thing to even label. And I know we could talk about that for 20 weeks, but if we were to try to at least have some grounding framework for what freedom is, where would we start?
Yeah. So interestingly, I hope I didn't do it, but I will avoid using the term free will at all costs because I don't know what that means. Freedom, I think, is much easier, at least in my mind, to think about. So I think of freedom as a property of a human being. Historically, and by that I mean, most, not all scholars agree that St. Augustine is the first to formulate what we call the free will problem. So kind of thinking about what is the extent to which our knowledge determines us to act? That's one way of thinking about the problem. And for hundreds and hundreds of years, scholars, theologians, philosophers have been worried about that, the extent to which humans can be free, given the fact that the external world has a causal nexus in which we are caught, and our internal world is stocked with beliefs, dispositions, and knowledge. And all of these things seem to conspire to push us into a deterministic world. And all of these questions, like Aquinas is one of my favorites on this, much to my students' chagrin, because Aquinas is like, okay, like does the intellect boss around the will, or does the will boss around the intellect, right? So kind of imagining that the intellect and the will are two faculties living in the soul or the mind, and the intellect is like, I always think of it as like a fishbowl. So it's like filling a fishbowl with rocks, and every little rock is a new piece of information. And then when there's a tipping point, does that mean the will is like, yep, that looks good to me? Or can the will look at a full fishbowl of knowledge and say, nah, like I see that all the evidence is on the side to suggest that this thing is true. And yet I'm going to say it's false. So this is kind of like the metaphysical debate. And then what we see happening, and of course, like doing the history of philosophy is always, there's always, at least for me, a sense of loss in the reading and the research that I do, because I know there are other thinkers who were thinking and writing about this, whose works were not thought fit to preserve. So we have this, I think of it as like a beautiful tapestry filled with holes. And my hope is that, I don't know, every once in a while, I feel like somebody goes to the basement of the Vatican and finds like a box filled with manuscripts. So I hope there's some women and people of color down there waiting to be recovered. But what we see through time is that in the early modern era, when white women, when their writings were thought fit to preserve, we see this other strand of discussion about freedom emerge. And the other strand is something along the lines of, okay, so for hundreds of years, we've had treatise upon treatise about the metaphysics of freedom. It's a gift God gives to everyone. How that's consistent with sin and error, that's a huge problem. And what this kind of new strand of thinkers starts doing is they're like, okay, like let's bracket the metaphysical. Let's just all agree freedom is a precious gift that God gave to everyone. When I look around the world, why is it that some people's lives are way more free than others? So what we get is a shift away, and people are still very worried about the metaphysics, but we get kind of a shift away from focusing exclusively on the metaphysics to acknowledging the metaphysical question and then moving to the social, political, cultural question. So Jean-Jacques Rousseau is very famous for opening his social contract treatise saying, man is born free and yet everywhere he is in chains. A French thinker named Gabrielle Suchon, several decades earlier, says exactly that, but about women. So we're all born free. We all have the divine gift of freedom, and yet women are everywhere in chains while men get to live freely. So when we're talking about freedom, not only do we have to be careful to define what we mean by it, but I think we also have to be careful to think about what kind of freedom. Like, are we talking about causal, like the metaphysics of causation, of decision making and action? Or are we talking about the social, cultural, political impediments to freely acting that are unequally distributed across different members of our communities?
There's some like distinguishment between like negative and positive freedom that kind of, right? That does something talking about that.
So right. So like the positive account is like freedom to execute your desires, your actions, or freedom from, and usually freedom from, I mean, at least historically, the conversations are all sort of organized around freedom from error, freedom from sin. So this is another feature of the discussion about whether the content of our intellect determines what we do. Some people might bristle at that and think, well, so the more I know, the less freedom I have, because the more sure I am about something, the less like why would I do otherwise if I'm clear about what's right? But one way of thinking about this is, well, maybe freedom is a freedom from sin and error. And so the less I use it, right? Like the more I can kind of align my will with the good and the true, then I don't, the ability to be free from error and sin becomes less important the more access to the good and the true that I have. So this is what some Christian theologians across time say, is that angels are free in the same way humans are, but angels have a direct sensation of the good. So the way I think about this is they're like moths drawn to a flame, where could they diverge? Yes, but they never will. Because why would you diverge from the good when it's right, when it's staring you in the face and you are drawn to it because of its beauty and its truth? Why would it be a good thing to have the ability to do otherwise?
But if there's no possibility of you not, doesn't that just mean you're not free?
Well, so I think the claim here is that they have the metaphysical freedom,
but
they never use it. But they never use it. They don't have to. So again, this is unsatisfying if you don't subscribe to the idea that the more knowledge we have, the more evident it is to us what the right thing to do is.
Do you believe that?
I'm very compelled by it. But the example that almost all the philosophers bring up is Medea in Ovid. So Ovid recounts the story of Medea, who murders her own children. And the kind of lamentation that she has is very relevant for this discussion, where she says, I see the good and I approve of it, and yet I do the worse. So in this case, she saw the good and approved of the good, namely, don't hurt your children, and yet she does the worse. So the question here is it possible for me or for any of us to see the good, so to have intellectual apprehension of the good and affirm it as such and do otherwise? To me, that is the core question of the core metaphysical question of human freedom. Can you say, I know this is good, I judge, like I affirm, not only I know it, I affirm it, I judge that it is good, and yet. So I think socially, we say that kind of stuff all the time, right? Yeah, yeah, yeah. I know I shouldn't text them back. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Right. Like, I know I should delete Instagram, right? Oh, yeah, yeah. I know that's good. Colloquially, we use that language all the time. And I think we can say we know things are right and good without truly knowing it. But I think it's a really fascinating question to think like, can I know and affirm that something is the good and yet not follow it?
Mm,
And I want to say no, it's not possible, but my students tell me every year that they do it all the time. So
yeah.
I don't know. What do you think?
I'm curious. I feel like I grew up in a world where I feel like the value systems of the household that I grew up in was so different from the value systems of the American culture that I was exposed to. And so it just became a practice growing up of having to constantly switch between these two
Mm-hmm.
completely different ways of not just what you do, but valuing what is most important in what a good life is. And when the framings are that different, the same action, which could be valued in one, is completely invalued in the other, and vice versa as well. And so, in those type of situations, I'm curious. I'm like, no matter how much knowledge I have, and for me, knowledge is the ability to predict. So ability to, okay, if
Yes.
I do this, this is what will happen.
Yes,
So that's what knowledge
precisely.
is. So even if I'm able to predict 100%, if I'm navigating these completely two different kind of frameworks of understanding the world, how can I ever, there's only good in relation to the context. There's no good objectively in that sense, you know? Because that's something I think a lot about where I'm like, the complexity of being human is that to me, a large component of something that is good should also be your ability to connect with others as like
Mm.
a consequence of that good. If
Yeah.
your goodness leads you to be isolated, I don't really know how good it truly is. And so in that sense, even if your society, for example, and we were bringing up this, where let's say you live in a place where everyone at 16 is drinking, even though you might be able to like rationalize why, okay, this might not be a good decision, blah, 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 because it does help you connect, because it does help you socialize and do what your peers are doing. In a particular context, that might actually be something that might be good,
Yeah.
which like so, but that's so like culturally, you can't, right? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
How can, that means good literally changes place to place.
Oh no, moral relativism. Oh
Yeah.
no. So yes. So I
But
think
that's the only,
yeah.
but sorry, the only reason I say that is because I think I place connection above
Yeah.
goodness.
So this is yeah, I think this is a really good dimension of the discussion to engage with, because when we think of historical philosophers who are engaging in this issue, they are all theologians. So they are, and they're monotheists. So I actually just on Wednesday, I taught Maimonides, the medieval Jewish thinker, who's a trip. I love him. And when we think about like Avicenna and Averroes and Alfarabi and Aquinas and Augustine, they're all structuring their notion of the good around God. So of course, the particularities of the religious systems are different, but if we're thinking about the history of Western philosophy, the good is not subjective, it's not relative, it's objective, and it's housed in the deity. What happens when we move away from that theory, and we move towards spiritual systems that are polytheist, that have very different ideas about cosmology and the creation of the universe and the purpose of humanity? And what happens when we move even further towards a purely secular idea? So I think what you're describing is, and this is, I think, another enormous challenge for all of us, which is really getting clear on what moral system we take to be right. So I think what you're just describing with respect to a clash of values, it sounds like, you know, what you experienced was inhabiting two worlds where the hierarchy of, I'll just use philosophical terminology, like the hierarchy of the virtues is different. So we might inhabit a family ecosystem where the highest virtue is respect. And nothing is permitted to happen where right, so like you might think that like, well, isn't honesty important? No, not here. Right, if honesty is going to come into friction with respect, it's not going to happen. You're not going to do it. However, we might also inhabit a friend group where honesty is the most important virtue, where people are like, no, really tell me, what did you think of my date? Right? Did you actually like them, or were you just being nice? Or what do you think of this outfit? Or I'm thinking of taking a gap here. What, like, tell me really honestly, tell me what you think. So we do inhabit all of these different spheres where we develop a kind of language of engagement that reflects how we understand the hierarchy of the virtues. I think so, and that really what I'm describing is virtue ethics, and kind of thinking about how to prioritize virtues when they come into conflict. Of course, not everybody is a virtue ethicist. There are utilitarians among us, and are there still deontologists? I don't know. I don't know. I don't know how popular the Kantian line is for our contemporary peers. But there are still, of course, many people whose entire moral compass is orchestrated around their religious community. So when we come into conflict with respect to the hierarchy of values, sometimes it is because of like, a kind of moral relativism or cultural relativism. Sometimes it is because secular values are coming into conflict with religious values. But the big question is, well, how do you negotiate these things? And I think it becomes really, really challenging. And this is something I've talked a lot with students about when I teach Intro to Moral Philosophy, which is it's actually, I think, very hard to be a good person. Because one of the things I think that we value in people is consistency. We want people to be, we want ourselves to be consistent. We want our loved ones and our coworkers to be consistent. And it's very hard to be consistent when you have a well thought through and established moral code, because it does mean doing things that may upset people or even harm people in the interest of you being true to your ethical beliefs. Maybe one last thing I'll say before getting your response is that, at the risk of bringing up Descartes twice in 40 minutes, here we go. Descartes famously in the Discourse, when he's talking, like the 4 sentences that he writes about ethics through his whole career, he says, when you're in a new town, in a new city, in an unfamiliar environment, like do as the Romans do, like adopt the local customs, because that is the right thing to do when you're in a new place. So, I think there is something to that about trying to figure out where you stand in a new environment is just go along with what people are doing. But of course, there have to be limits to that advice, depending on the kind of community that you're entering.
I guess throughout my life, I've just put on so many different like costumes to be good in different type of environments and stuff. I've really, I think in some ways given up. I kind of just go based on vibes in some ways now, like where I feel like I've given up to some extent trying to like be like, okay, this is good, this isn't good, just in the sense of like how much people differ is kind of crazy in terms of what is good, But
Yeah.
but then I think there's something that is deeply embodied where like I know when for at least what I think is good. There's something I don't even need to sometimes rationalize it. Where I'm just like when I do this, I don't know whether it's like when I'm watering plants, like whatever. I think if you can align yourself in some way to what is beautiful,
Yeah.
I think in some ways, and you just like work towards things to make things more beautiful, to like if you just have some values like that, okay, like things that are deeply integrated, things that are very beautiful in is good, then you can just, I think, in an embodied way, just kind of move towards that without having to like rationally think through, is this
Yeah.
good every single time? So
Yeah.
I feel like I just have few of those. I'm like, okay, like are people feeling connected? Do people feel seen? Do I feel like I'm making whatever I'm interacting with far more beautiful? Am I being present and intentional? I feel like I have like few of those, and then as long as am I authentic and honest, and as long as I'm like moving towards that, I'm like, okay, that's good. But I think I don't know what else. I don't know how to, even move forward to connect that piece between um, how different people's value systems are and how to, be
Hmm.
good.
But I think, I mean, you've just outlined your virtues.
Hmm.
And, I guess the question I would put to you is if you, and maybe this has happened to you, if you find yourself in an environment where there's a person who is actively preventing everyone from being engaged, what would you do? Like, let's say you were in an
Hmm.
environment where there's somebody who is like, I don't think women have anything to contribute here, and is kind of trying, I mean, extreme example, but we're philosophers, go to the
Yeah.
extremes, right? Like somebody who's like, no, this is like a conversation that they have nothing to contribute to. And maybe that person is using their body to try to block
Yeah.
women
Yeah.
from
Fair.
entering the space, like, would you just let that happen because that's something that's happening in that environment and you're a newcomer? Or would you feel like
Yeah.
that coming into tension with your value?
So I guess okay, this is where, and tell me what you think because maybe I'm crazy. I truly, when I say this, I really mean this. Like I don't use the labels of like good and bad on people. So even when I like experience someone that I like very strongly, I'm like, I don't agree with what you're doing. I don't view them necessarily as a bad person. And in the same way, I don't view myself as a good person. I don't think I'm a good person. And so I just feel like humans just do things based on what they think is right. And I genuinely feel like even people who are doing something I think is terrible, in their perspective, they truly think what they're doing is right. And I think the reason I feel this way is because I've just grown up around a lot of people that I love who I think do quote unquote bad things. But after putting myself in their shoes, I truly kind of
Yeah.
can understand why they think what they're doing is right. And so then I'm kind of in this weird place where I'm like, based on my view of the world, I think what you're doing is wrong. But from your side, I understand what. So I think like true in that sense, I really like The Dark Knight for this reason, where it's like the Joker is like the only one who kind of he doesn't actually. And I think there's another really good movie, which is No Country for Old Men. Have you seen that movie?
Too scary. No, can't watch.
No,
Too scary.
no, it's not too. It's not a horror movie or anything.
So
But
you know what? Just as a quick sidebar, because No Country for Old Men and There Will Be Blood came out at the same time, I always mix them up. So I think There Will Be Blood is the one that's really scary.
okay,
Okay,
yeah.
anyway.
But No Country, actually, but yeah, there are a few, I guess, yeah, but they're not horror movies, but there are,
Okay,
I guess, like
okay.
thrillers. But no, but the quote unquote the antagonist in No Country for Old Men is really interesting because he's the first bad guy who just goes based off of chance. He just like, but it's an interesting conversation on free will because he at the end of the day does choose to flip a coin. But he's like at like there's this really powerful scene. He's at this like cash counter and he's like flip the coin. He tells the dude to flip the coin. He's like go flip the coin, and the guy's like no, you're making me flip the coin. I'm not gonna flip the coin for my life. But he like makes these like really big decisions completely based off of chance. And I think the Dark Knight also does a great job of this, where like the Joker kind of just plays as like an opposite force of Batman, where he's not necessarily like he doesn't have his own kind of evil plans for the world, but he's like the Batman can't just push his virtue, like what he believes is right, and so I'm going to do whatever I can
Right.
to oppose that power. And so I do feel in that sense like everyone is just imposing what they think is right on the world. Some people just feel like their right is more right. And so even in that example you gave, how do I know I'm not the bad person by making that person stop? Just because like I think I'm right, that person just thinks that person is right, and they're
Mhm.
doing what they think is right. If I do the same thing, am I not in some ways doing the same thing? How can I be so assured that my right is more right than their right?
Yeah. So I think you're kind of putting your finger on why this is actually really hard. Because I think maybe an additional question to layer on here is if we hold the values that we do and create the hierarchies of virtues that we have, um it seems like the reason we would give for why we have the hierarchy that we do is because we think it's right. And I think there's an additional question here about whether we have a moral responsibility or a duty to fight for what we think is right. So I take your point exactly that, and I actually think you're right. Even people who are excluding, like people who hold, views about human rights and wanting to deny human rights to certain groups. I find those views repugnant, but I can see that there's a rational pathway for them to getting there, and that they think they are doing what's right, even though I think it's repugnant. So I think one question for us is, as human beings, as moral agents, do we have a moral responsibility to try to convince people who we think are wrong? And, so it's interesting because I think it comes to mind the sort of example from Kant about, the famous example of like the murderers at the door saying like, "Where's Julie? Let me in." And you're like, "Oh yeah, second room on the right. I can't lie according to Kant. So just, go ahead with your murdering." But of course, another option available to Kant is just to like close the door, right? Or to, leave the door open, but leave the like, there's lots of other options, right? So in the kind of example that I've given you, one pathway for you is to try to convince the person they're wrong and just try to bring the other people in the room into the ability to connect, but you can also leave. So there are other things we can do to signal our disagreement that are, that are not the same as trying to convince people that they're wrong or trying to impose our own standard on people. We can just absent ourselves from the situation.
Yeah. What I have found, I'm curious what you think, what I have found to be the most effective often is, I think a lot of people, I've realized, have a lot of hate in their hearts purely as a consequence of fear. And I think people often are very afraid, whether it's for themselves, and oftentimes their anger towards other comes from a place of like love in a weird sense, but it's become so distorted that their love for their family or whatever has become distorted into something that's fear of the other, and the other is often everyone else on the planet.
Yeah.
And I think it's sometimes so sad. And so what I have found, especially with a lot of men in my life, is just like giving space for them to talk and like really allowing them to share, even if your views I truly don't agree with, to just like hear them out. Like, why, where did that come from? How, and then as they speak more and more and more over weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks or months and years, I just find everyone to just become so much less angry.
Yeah.
And then naturally, as a consequence, they move through the. But I didn't even have to say. I didn't have to be like, "Well, you're rationally wrong because of this reason and this reason." You just like let them get their anger out, and hopefully, once there's enough of that kind of leaving, then whatever's left is more, I guess, genuine and pure. And I do think people are just so driven by fear that. But that's why I feel like I used to try the kind of like, let me argue my way out of this, but it just doesn't. No one changes. No one changes based on rationality, and that's why I'm curious with the connecting it back to freedom. I don't think people often make decisions based on like, let me like think through all the details I have. Sometimes it's just an emotion. Like I do think people are very. So can you, in that sense, like, does that information play even a role?
Yeah. So I think when we think about, again, these historical accounts of freedom, the discussion is very much separated from the bodily response. And of course, Western philosophy has a long history of wanting to get the mind in a position that is as free of the body, for lack of a better word, as free of the body as possible. So, true freedom is going to be not being influenced at all by your emotions, your passions, your appetites, but just kind of being fully determined to the extent that we can, by reason and intellect and that kind of thing. But as you rightly say, the lived experience of being a human is that a lot of things happen kind of under the surface of reason. We're just sort of on autopilot for a lot of stuff, and it doesn't seem to bother us. And I think there's a sense in which we are operating based on the information we have and the predictive power that we have based on that information, just kind of without thinking about it. But I think the conversations about freedom and trying to figure out what exactly the power gives us I think the idea there is that if we can develop a compelling answer to that question, then we can figure out how to be happier, because freedom and happiness have to be connected.
Why?
Oh, well, I guess I mean, maybe not for you and me, but I think like for the historical accounts, the idea here is like, okay, so, um, what is the purpose of human life? This is one of the big questions that philosophers try to answer. And so a very common answer to this question is the purpose is contentment or happiness. And then the question is, well, how do we get there? And that's where conversations about freedom start to come in. And right, because once we kind of pose the possibility that humans are here to be happy, a very quick observation is that why are so many people miserable? Like, if the point of human life is happiness, why is there so much misery? And then to answer that question, then you're like, okay, well, there's misery because people are doing it wrong, right? They're humaning wrong. That's why they're not happy. And if we start to think about what errors we make in using our capacities, a very kind of easy place to blame is, well, we're not using our gift of freedom in the right kind of way. And then that opens a whole conversation about, well, what does it mean to use it in the right kind of way? Is it gathering knowledge? Is it trying to suppress the passions and the emotions? Is it, so these are the conversations that come next. So I think as an object of analysis, even if it's not present to our mind every time we're acting and moving through the world, once we put it under the microscope, as it were, the idea is that knowing more about how this faculty, how this power operates, will empower us to use it better to the extent that we can. But that doesn't take account at all of the external features of the world that may be just constantly throwing up obstacles to our ability to use that power well. So if I may, just for a moment, talk a little bit about the philosopher that I mentioned, who I think anticipates Rousseau's very famous claim about we're all born free, but everywhere we're in chains. Gabrielle Suchon, who was writing right at the turn of the Enlightenment. So she published a book in 1693 and another in 1700. She starts, metaphysical gift of God, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so why are women blocked in every domain of life from actually living a free life? So she chronicles all of this stuff. And one of the things that I think is really striking about her work that I'm working on actually right now is this idea that I think for her, the bedrock underlying component that is required for humans to be free is financial independence. And this is something that you don't see thinkers talking about in the early modern period. At least like the male thinkers are not really talking about this in any great detail. And her analysis is like, well, if you become a wife, you have no money of your own. If you become a nun, you have no money of your own. And if you have no money of your own, you can't choose who you spend time with. You can't choose where to put your body in space. And you don't have the resources to hire mentors, teachers, or to buy books. And so she very much subscribes to this early modern idea about we are the more we know, the more free we are. But she acknowledges and identifies that the social and structural features of society oppress people in different ways. But to the extent that that oppression is financial, freedom is impossible. And I think that's actually an incredibly powerful observation for her to make. And it rings true still today, that without freedom, without financial freedom, financial independence, it is very hard to do much of anything else.
I have some thoughts. Before I was gonna ask you, if what is your capacity looking like? How much longer do you feel like you have in the tank to be talking about freedom? And
I think I'm gonna have to go in like 20 minutes.
perfect.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll end it at
Okay.
11:35.
Great.
Perfect. So there's two things. One, the connection between. Okay, let me write this down just so I don't forget. There's two things. One between freedom and happiness, and then second, the point that you just made right now. But maybe we can start with the second one. So I think even with financial freedom, it's really interesting because I'm trying to think about how to say this. Like what it takes to become financially free, that process itself can then become a chain in some sense, right? Where it's
Yes.
like
Yes.
I mean, paying a mortgage, I feel like is one of the best. You know, you have money, you buy a home, you start paying a mortgage. In a lot of ways, a mortgage is a chain in so many ways. And I think there are so many financial. You buy a nice car, now you have to. It's a chain. You have to take care of it. You got to make sure you have every time you leave the house, it has to be parked in a nice place. I feel like but I guess that's not necessarily financial freedom. That's like that's more of a buying a thing. But I wonder if is anyone truly free? I feel like no one is truly all that free. But and I'm assuming that might be a deeply privileged perspective, maybe because I think maybe the kind of the range of freedom is
Yeah.
so different. But I do think in often sense everyone's kind of just like some people's chains are their own and other people's chains are others. I think that's the big difference. But I do think
Yeah.
everyone's chained down to something. But some
Yeah.
people choose their own chains.
Yeah. So I think financial independence is a necessary but not sufficient condition for freedom. I think that's important. So we can think of lots of people who have tons of financial independence who we might not think are free in the kind of rational, the sense of like their actions are being utterly determined by reason. Um, but I think to your point of who would count as being free, and I think on Suchon's view, uh, if you're married, you're not free. If you're a parent, especially, you're not free. If you're in a convent, you're not free. She has a lot to say about servants, which I think is fascinating. She seems to, I think, really astutely see that the master-servant relationship reduces the freedom of both parties because there's
Mm,
moral dependence that cannot be
yeah.
escaped in that. So her view is that freedom requires a life without, the way she puts it, is a life without engagements.
Yeah.
And the way that I understand engagement on her view is an engagement is entering into a relationship of moral dependence of some kind. And
My parents would call that responsibility.
well, but this is this is why I think the parent-child relationship is so fascinating. And this is something I've never been able to really flesh it out in a way that I'm satisfied with. But there's so many early modern women writing about marriage and the sort of harms of marriage. And I wonder for how many of them the true harm is parenthood. So they're horrible husbands, no question. But of course, in this era, getting married is effectively synonymous with pregnancy and having children and kind of the rest for women, like the rest of your fertile years being caught in a
Mm,
cycle of pregnancy and child rearing. And so the dependence you have with a spouse can be very bad depending on the nature of the spouse. But the dependence you have with children is, children can be, sweeter and less sweet, but the dependence is intense and it doesn't go away. It changes as they age. Okay, speaking as somebody who doesn't have children, just for the record, but it changes as they age, but the dependence doesn't go away. And I think it's interesting
mm,
because today it seems like children never stop the cycle of right? Like you're dependent on your parents. And then there's a moment where that switches and they become dependent on you. But the moral responsibility is undischargeable. There's nothing either party can do to release themselves from the moral debt.
Yeah.
So then if you take that picture of freedom, I think you're exactly right. It's like, well, who's free? It's a person who has financial independence, who has taken no vow of any kind, marriage,
which is even a job.
Well, so I think a job is really interesting because I think on her view, you could have a job as long as you didn't need the money.
Yeah. Yeah.
And this is something
which is almost not a thing. At least.
But this is something wealthy people sometimes do, right? Like sometimes wealthy people will like work at the local library, or I guess wealthy people typically volunteer rather than take a salary. But I think there is something to that where like, yeah, like maybe I'll work at the local library to like help my community, but like I don't need the paycheck or something like that. Because I think the minute you need it, the minute you're in a need relationship, there's a debt. And it just becomes, I love her. Yeah, I love her view. I'll send you my paper when it's done.
Yeah.
But I think this is, but there's something so contemporary, I think, about this insight that, so one of the things that I find really interesting about her view is that it anticipates, it's certainly not the same as, but it anticipates a kind of Nietzsche type view about moral relationships reducing to financial ones. Or moral debts reducing to financial debts. And Suchon is a pious Christian lady, so she does think that there's this objective good that undergirds all of this stuff, and that God, the relationship with God is a moral good and that sort of thing, which prevents her from collapsing all morality into, nihilism. But the seeds of it are there. And I think that's really fascinating.
Dang. And in her view, is living a free life a good life?
So she calls them neutralists. So only a neutralist can be free, and only a free person can be happy. So she condemns, without being explicit about it, but she condemns wives, mothers, nuns, to unhappiness and unfreedom.
But I wonder what a society would look like from her perspective where everyone was free. I mean, it seems like no one would, right?
Well, I think the challenge is that, so it's interesting because in this era, there are lots of thinkers who are writing utopias. So kind of imagining, okay, like what is the utopia where women have access to education and what's going on? That's not what she does. She writes a treatise that imagines a society as the one she has then, but that just has space for this other way of living. So
it's kind of like becoming a monk, I feel like I'm hearing.
Kind of, but you need, like, even the monks need somebody to maintain their water system and bring them food. Yeah. So I think this is another element of these conversations that's always so interesting, which is, I think for Suchon, could society run if everyone was free? I think the answer is no.
Yeah.
Because somebody still has to raise the crops and sweep the streets. And so it is a claim to a kind of social stratification. However, I think in Suchon's defense, she thinks that, and maybe people are wrong about their callings, but she does seem to suggest that some people are called to be wives and mothers, other people are called to be nuns, and that's their life path. So maybe there are life paths that actually exclude freedom, but have other virtues.
Yeah. I feel a lot of this conversation has, I was telling you earlier about just the transition of moving. I've really valued freedom. I was telling you earlier too, but I've lived a life full of freedom now, but I'm realizing how like unrooted I am because of that. And that's caused a lot of really cool things. But I think now I'm coming to a point where I'm like, I think maybe one route would be nice. But then one route quickly changes to 2 and 3 and 4. And then all of a sudden you're so rooted, you're like, what happened? But I I'm getting to a point now where I'm like, okay, well, I did all, I think I became relatively free, but I'm kind of confused now where to go from here. I'm like, okay,
Yeah.
well, you just kind of like disassociate from everything. You have no real grounding and you're doing what you want. But then I don't know. And so that I feel like there's a lot of connections to what even I might have to read some of your work and some of her work too, just to see like what it looks like. Because yeah, I think freedom often the choice to relinquish freedom, I think, is where a lot of like joy actually comes from. But you have to always know you made that choice and it was never
Yeah.
forced upon you. But,
Yeah.
you know, yeah,
Yeah. I mean, there are whole like religious sects that want to relinquish their freedom to God's will. And that's true
yeah,
love. I mean, this is, of course, that was a heresy, just for the record, but still, like, there's a long history of people who feel the like incredible power of the love of God and say, if God, if God truly is all knowing and all loving and all powerful, how could there be a better way to live than to subsume my will under his and just let
mm,
him move through me? Um,
mm,
yeah.
dang. I mean, these have been some of my favorite episodes, and I just feel like you're such a great conversationalist, and I
It's been
would love to,
wonderful.
yeah, in the future, maybe we could have like an ongoing 6 months, a year, have you on. I mean, I would
I'd
love to
love
just keep,
that.
yeah, I would
Yeah.
love to
Yeah.
just keep knowing what you're working on and going through because I mean, truly, I think to meet people at the intersection of academics, but also people who just like enjoy talking are also curious themselves and you know haven't lost themselves in the towers so high that they forget that other people exist is truly I think unfortunately really rare in academia and it's
Mm.
actually very nice to meet real humans because it also just like it makes it feel so much more like a thing that people want to go into. I think oftentimes it can
Yeah.
be so daunting to meet people who are just like unapproachable that it's just
Yeah.
like you don't inspire me in any ways to want to get closer to that. But I think people like you are just great to just like be like, you can be an academic and also still be a human, not just a
That's
walking brain.
good.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I
So,
love that.
yeah. So I want to say thank you so much for 2 hours of your time. And I mean, I think even more, maybe. I think it might be 2.5 hours, but this was truly a pleasure and it was amazing talking to you.
I really had a wonderful time and I'd love to come back. I have lots more to
Oh.
say, so.
Oh yeah, no. I feel we've just been scratching the surface. I can tell when I'm like there is gold mines of content to just be talked about. But yeah, I want to say thank you all for listening. I hope you enjoyed both of these conversations with Julie. I feel like it's been such an amazing one, and I hope you enjoyed as much as I did. We will be wrapping up season 10 soon, so I hope you enjoyed everything we've talked about, pleasure and meaning. And I hope you're having a great week. And as per usual, stay re educated.